Zoe Norwood, and on behalf of Rockford Public Library, I welcome you all to hear Anders Morley talk about his memoir, This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the Northern Winter, followed by a discussion where you can comment or ask questions. We thank our wonderful partner for this event, the Natural Land Institute, represented this evening by Kim Johnson, Mark Luthen, Jill Canay, and possibly others. I'm pleased to let you know that this program is being recorded. So if you know of people missing this, they should call the library to find out when it's up on the RPL YouTube. And before I retire from working at Rockford Public Library day after tomorrow, I'll try to email you about the YouTube. During Anders' talk, you'll all be muted except for Anders, myself, Kim, and our IT host, Bobby Cozen. If you're unmuted, please mute yourself. All are welcome to keep your video on, and it's great seeing so many faces. More may join in, possibly including some. Well, actually, I don't think there's anybody on the waiting list right now. If you'd like to read or listen to the book, Rockford Public Library has copies to check out. The audio is available to RPL card holders through Hoopla and Cloud Library. And of course, you can purchase copies through a bookseller. I'm now pleased to turn this over to Kim Johnson from the Natural Land Institute. Kim?
Thank you, Zoe. Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Johnson. I'm the Director of Marketing and Membership for Natural Land Institute. And I want to thank Rockford Public Library and Zoe Norwood especially for inviting us to be a part of this presentation, to co-sponsor this virtual book talk and discussion. It's been fun working with Zoe and Anders and getting to know him during this process. And I'm really looking forward to hearing his talk tonight. I want to also introduce, we have Jill Canay on the call with us. She's our assistant director. And then we have our vice president, Mark Luthen, who's vice president of our board of trustees, and his wife, Lori. I want to thank them both because they sponsored Anders to be with us tonight. So thank you very much, Mark and Lori, for sponsoring Anders. And just a little bit of information about Natural Land Institute. I know several of you are familiar with NLI, so I'll try to be quick and brief. We are a conservation land trust that is a 501c3 not-for-profit that was founded in 1958 by George Fell. And during the past 63 years, we have protected more than 18,000 acres of land. Our mission is to create an enduring legacy of natural land in Northern Illinois for people, plants, and animals. And our vision is that people will recognize they are a part of nature, not apart from it. We seek to do this by hosting events and workshops and programs such as this, where people can learn about our work and be inspired to love and protect nature. We've hosted several virtual book discussions in the last 2 years because of the pandemic, but this is the first time, aside from our own nature, poetry, and prose anthology that features 14 writers, this is the first time we've actually had one of the authors join us for a book discussion. So again, this is very exciting to me personally. I really enjoyed the whole book, and Michael made some comments. I totally agree with what he said about the book. There's just so many interesting things about the book. So Anders, thank you for writing this and sharing your experiences with us. So I'm looking forward to seeing the photos, because every time you mentioned somebody took a photo of you, I thought, where's the photo? I want to see the photo. And I hope that they would email the photos to you so that you would have them. So anyway, as a reminder to everyone, be sure to mute yourself, mute your mic, and then when we get into the discussion part of the program, use the raise hand emoji, which is down at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a raised hand, and you can click on that if you have a question. Anders will be looking for those, and if he misses some, I'll also be looking for those raised hands in case he doesn't see yours, and I can mention, hey, so-and-so has a question or comment for you. We do plan to be done by 7:30, but we can go a little bit longer if needed. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Anders.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim, for that introduction. Thank you, Zoe, also for your introduction. And thanks to the Rockford Library and to the Natural Land Institute for the possibility of coming to you this evening, so to speak, virtually, to talk about my book, This Land of Snow. I'm excited. I'm in a way particularly excited about this event because I have Rockford roots. My mother was born and raised in Rockford. So it's kind of exciting. I've only ever passed through town, I have to say. But you know, this is the second best thing. So my book, This Land of Snow, this is what it looks like. At its most basic level, it tells the story of a winter that I spent traveling across northwestern Canada, and I was on cross-country skis. Really, just because I think that cross-country skis are the best and kind of most logical way of moving across a snow-covered winter landscape. So it's not so much a book about, you know, cross-country skiing as an athletic pursuit. That just is sort of the way that I got across winter. But the book is, I hope, more than just an adrenaline-driven adventure. I didn't want to write, you know, just that kind of story. There are lots of books like that out there. I find them a bit repetitive after a while, although I've read many of them and enjoyed them. I wanted to write something that might appeal to people who weren't cross-country skiers themselves, or people who weren't even necessarily adventurous, you know, armchair travelers. And so I didn't want to start the story and end it with the journey. I wanted to put it in the context of my life because it seemed like my decision on to go on this journey had some kind of importance in my own development. And I also wanted to add more facets to the story, to think about things like our relationship to winter, our relationship to wild spaces, how we move across landscapes. And so I've tried to sort of weave all of these things together in the book, and I hope that I've done so successfully. So what I want to do this evening, first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the journey, how and why it occurred to me to do something like this. And then I'm going to take you along the trail with me and stop at 2 or 3 places to read some short passages from the book, just so you kind of have a taste of what it's like for those of you who haven't read it yet or are thinking about reading it. And I think I'm just going to hop over to screen share right away and use some pictures to accompany me and kind of guide me along. So bear with me for just a split second here while I share my screen and go over to slideshow mode. Now, Kim or Zoe, would you just give me a thumbs up if my slideshow is in fact occupying the whole screen? Great. Okay, good. So there's our title page. Now, one of the first questions that I had to answer when I decided that I was going to write a book about my winter traveling across northwestern Canada was, where do I start the story? Because as I said before, I didn't want to start with the moment my skis hit the snow. And so I had to do a bit of thinking, and I came up with a few answers. So in the book, I talk a little bit about my childhood, my early love of skiing, and other things like that. But one of the answers I came up with was with the guy you see on your screen right now. Now this is Tony Matt, and Tony Matt was an Austrian ski racer who left Austria in 1938 when the Germans annexed Austria. And he left in the company of a few other skiers, ski instructors, and ski racers. And all of them came as a group to a town in northern New Hampshire called North Conway, which is a major ski center. And they opened a ski school when they got there, which, as far as I'm aware, is the first kind of organized alpine ski school in the United States. So they were responsible for introducing this new sport. Excuse me, because before that, Nordic skiing had been more prevalent. But anyway, Tony Matt is best remembered today for his for being a ski racer rather than a ski instructor. And perhaps his most famous race was run down the side of Mount Washington, which is the highest mountain in New Hampshire and in the Northeast in general. And it's what you're looking at on your screen. It's just actually about 25 miles east of where I am right now. My house is somewhere off in the distance behind the mountain where I'm speaking to you from. There was a race that was run on Mount Washington in the 1930s, and it was known as the American Inferno. And it was run for the third and last time in 1939. It was that year that Tony Matt participated in the race, and as it happened, he won the race by a significant margin. So the course is about 4 miles, went down from the top of Mount Washington, and then dropped into that kind of bowl that you see at the middle of the picture, which is a glacial cirque called Tuckerman Ravine. And then from there, it went down another 2 miles through the woods to the bottom of the mountain. Now, Tony Matt had never skied on Mount Washington before, and so he just pushed off from the top and kind of went into a chute and sped down as fast as he could. Now, his plan was when he got to the lip of the ravine there, Tuckerman Ravine, to do a few turns and slow himself down before going over the vertical head wall. But he miscalculated and went straight over the head wall, and Schutke just kind of kept skiing straight down the mountain and got to the bottom in 6.5 minutes. Now, 6.5 minutes was less than half of the existing record, which was somewhere above 13 minutes. So, that's pretty astonishing. And it's particularly incredible if you think about what skis looked like in 1939. They were basically just wooden planks with cables that wrapped around your heels. Now, the reason I'm telling this story is because it was a story I heard a lot as a kid. My family spent a lot of time hiking on and around Mount Washington. And in the winter, we did a lot of downhill skiing at a mountain just across the valley. And so this was the view that we had. And my dad loved to tell the story of Tony Matt and this crazy descent of Mount Washington. And in his telling, Tony Matt tore down the mountain. When he got to the bottom, he was greeted by cheering crowds. But he just paid them no attention because he was so shaken up, so terrified at what he had just done. Coming down the mountain as fast as he could easily have, killed himself. And so, according to my dad, he just took off his skis, picked them up, and walked over to his car and put them down in front of his car, ran over them and broke them in half, and then drove off and never skied again. So it was this very dramatic ending, and it was for that reason probably this a memorable story to me. Again, as I said, I'd heard many times. And so when I sat down to start telling my own story, I thought that this would be a good one to use to frame my own story at some point in the book. And the reason it appealed to me was because it seemed to contain an insight, and that insight was that sometimes it's possible to take our passions a little bit too far. And that idea is certainly in the book. So I started skiing when I was 5 years old, first downhill skiing, and it was another 5 years or so before I discovered cross-country skiing. It really was a discovery. I was kind of rummaging around in my parents' basement one day, as kids do, and I found this old pair of wooden cross-country skis and poles and boots, old leather boots, and I'd never seen them before. And I asked my parents about them, and I found out that they were my mother's. I'd never seen my mother on cross-country skis or any kind of skis. And so I also discovered that my shoe size at that point was about the same as my mother's. And so I took the skis and the boots outside and put the boots on and clipped into the skis and wandered off into the woods. I grew up in this, out in the woods in the country in New Hampshire. There was usually plenty of snow. And so pretty soon, these cross-country skis just became my way of wandering around in the woods in the winter time instead of walking, of course. And really, my relationship, my attitude, my approach to cross-country skiing hasn't really evolved very much from there. It's kind of quantitatively, I suppose, it's evolved, but not qualitatively. I've never really been the kind of person that does a lot of skiing at, Nordic centers and prepared tracks occasionally, but I prefer to just wander off into the woods and tromp around in the snow. Now, to get this story moving along, we're going to have to fast forward about 20 years to the time when I was in graduate school. And I needed, for what I was working on, I needed to learn to read German pretty quickly. And so I decided to just go to Germany and spend a semester taking an intensive language course. And while I was there, I met the woman you see in the picture, whose name is Elena, and she had come from Italy to take the same language course. And to make a long story short, we started dating and became a couple. And a couple of years later, I found myself living in northern Italy, in the town you see on your screen now, which is called Bergamo. And Bergamo is right at the foot of the Alps. You can see the foothills just rising at the back of the picture here. And I lived there for 7 or 8 years, and it's a lovely place in many ways. And I was happy. Ellen and I got married a few years after I'd moved there, and things were going along pretty smoothly until at some point this sense of unease started to sort of creep into my consciousness, and I didn't really know what it was about. I knew that I was aware of the fact that it was homesickness, but it had been sort of this low level, manageable sort of homesickness, but it started to intensify. And so I missed kind of the quiet and the relative open spaces of northern New England. Italy is, a noisy and crowded country for the most part. I missed winter as well. But it was more than that. I think I wasn't exactly happy with the work I was doing, and just kind of in a general way, the shape that my life had taken didn't really match my expectations. It seemed, far different from what I had expected to be doing at that point in life. But rather than, look inside for a solution to the problem, I just started kind of blaming everyone around me and everything around me, and really kind of got sick of life in Italy. And it was while I was in the midst of this crisis that one day, quite by chance, I picked up a copy of the National Geographic magazine at a newsstand. And when I got home, I opened it up, and it just flopped open to the picture that you're looking at now. It was a 2-page spread. And before I even knew what I was looking at, or knew what the article that the picture was attached to was about, something about this picture just kind of leapt out at me and seemed to say that this was what I needed to be doing. This was the medicine for my malaise. Now, I mentioned that I'd been a cross-country skier for a long time. It was something that I did as much as I could in the Alps as well, even in Italy. And but I also, for a long time, had dreamt of going on some kind of a very long continental scale self-propelled journey. Now, I'd often thought that would be something like the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, or something like that, in the summertime. But suddenly, upon seeing this picture, I thought, oh, I could put these two things together, my love of cross-country skiing and this dream of going on a long journey. And I could go on a long journey on cross-country skis. And that's really where the idea started. And from there, it just kind of started to grow. I became an object of my daydreams, really, for a while. And I started to think practically about it. Where would I go? And pretty soon it became obvious that Canada was the best choice. I happened to be a dual citizen of Canada and the US. My father is Canadian. And so I knew that I could spend as much time as I wanted to in Canada. And then I started to think, more specifically, where exactly would I go? What route would I take? Would I go east to west? And I started thinking about equipment. I started spending more time up in the Alps, exploring on my skis with my little dog that you see in the picture. And I started reading a lot about other people who had explored on skis. And one of the names that kept cropping up was that of Fridtjof Nansen, is on your screen right now. Fridtjof Nansen is perhaps the greatest of Norwegian explorers. The Norwegians are probably the greatest wintertime explorers. So Nansen, in the late 19th century, became the first to cross the Greenland ice cap, and then later he attempted to reach the North Pole and got closer than anyone ever had. But what I really liked about Nansen was that I'd read some of his biographies in the past. And one of the things that I really liked about Nansen was that he seemed to have a similar philosophy of skiing to my own. He just liked to go off and ski, and that was his way of moving around in the wintertime. It wasn't about, it wasn't like a sport for him, really. Now the problem with this is that at this point, all of what I've been saying for the past 5 minutes is kind of, again, daydreaming. And I hadn't had a conversation with my wife about it. But meanwhile, the plan had taken, a pretty concrete kind of shape in my head. And so when one day I did mention it to my wife, to her it seemed like I was announcing my intention to embark on this journey. And in retrospect, that probably is the way that things went. I was so excited about it and had grown very attached to the plan. But needless to say, perhaps it did not go over well with my wife. The idea of me leaving for 4 or 5 months and going off to these remote places in a very cold season to do something that she thought was very dangerous, and also, I should say, something that she thought was totally senseless because she has no interest in winter and is not an especially outdoorsy person. And so it was kind of like an explosion in our marriage, and we both kind of just started to butt heads over it, and things got worse and worse. And the issue became kind of a wedge that just over the course of the year to come kind of drove us farther and farther apart. But nevertheless, I think 14 months after our first conversation on the subject, here I was in Vancouver at the bus station with this huge pile of stuff ready to head north and start skiing east from the west coast. Now, I should say at this point that I was all but certain that in deciding to embark at this point on the journey, that I was all but sure that I wasn't going to be going back to Italy and to my marriage. I had essentially sacrificed my marriage to go on this journey, and I was in some ways so angry with my wife and with her reaction. I failed to see, how she could see what I was doing as selfish. And so I was angry on my own account, and in a way, the journey had also become kind of a way of putting this distance between us. So it took on a new meaning of its own. Now, this theme of this marriage, apparently disintegrating marriage, kind of going into this downward spiral, is central to the book, but it doesn't take up as many pages as the description of the journey itself. But the two stories run in parallel, and it's something that I return to at the end of the book. Now, I'm not going to say much about it this evening, but I will return to it at the end of my talk, and it's there. And when we have our conversation afterwards, feel free to talk about it. I mean, I think I'm very open about it in the book, so I'm not embarrassed by questions about that. So from Vancouver, I headed north on a series of boats, and then eventually this larger ship up the Inside Passage. Now, the Inside Passage is a coastal channel that runs up among these thousands of islands along the British Columbia coast and then into southeast Alaska. And my destination was a town, Canada's northernmost Pacific port called Prince Rupert. Now, Prince Rupert claims to be the rainiest town on Earth. I'm sure other towns make that same claim. But as we came into port, the sun came out about as much as it does in that part of the world, which seemed to me like a good omen. I didn't expect to find any snow in Prince Rupert. It has a pretty mild winter, like Seattle and Vancouver and Juneau and other places along the same coast. And so to get snow, you either have to go up high or go inland. And so my plan in Prince Rupert was to take my skis and my sled and a few other snow-related things and put them on a Greyhound bus and have them freighted eastward to the next inland town, which is about 90 miles inland. And that town is called Terrace. And then I would start walking from Prince Rupert towards Terrace, where I would be reunited with my equipment. Now, when I came into Terrace, winter had just moved in, perfect timing. So at this point, it was late November, and this was really the first big blizzard of the year. It snowed about 1.5 feet, and more than that up in the mountains. And from that point on until the end of my journey in March, I would never again see an unsnow-covered landscape. So it was very good snow here. I was lucky in that regard. And another thing that happened in Terrace was I realized that I was carrying much more equipment than I wanted or needed to be carrying. And so I checked into this motel and spent a few days kind of weeding through my equipment to try to reduce its weight and its bulk. And I managed to cut it down considerably. And then I was ready to head into the mountains. So my first objective once I was on my skis was to cross this mountain range called the Kitimat Range. And the Kitimat Range is just a sub-range of the coast mountains. And the coast mountains themselves are just the northern extension of what in the US we call the Cascade Range. So going up from Northern California, the mountains go all the way up to the Yukon, really. And so I was crossing them in this little Kitimat Range. And my goal was to go from the town of Terrace about 100 miles east, up a valley, a river valley, and then over a pass, and then down another valley, and to reach a little village called Telqua. I'm going to show you a map in a minute, so bear with me. And so when I headed into the mountains, this is just, I'm about to head up this valley to start climbing up to this pass, Telqua Pass. There was quite a bit of snow, but it was very wet and sticky snow, and it was pretty warm. It was still early winter, and I was still very close to the Pacific. So you can see there's lots of moisture in the air. And at first it was kind of a gradual climb, and there was a snowmobile track for the first 20 miles or so, which I was able to follow. And that made the going much easier. I didn't have to break a trail. And so this is more or less what it looked like. And kind of a parenthesis is, I think, appropriate. So here, this is 2 or 3 days into the journey, looking back towards the west. You can see it was like this sort of staircase progression. But the parenthesis is here for anyone who is not a cross-country skier, or perhaps even in the Midwest, even if you are a cross-country skier, you don't really need climbing skins most of the time. So climbing skins are these things which are very handy for people who ski in hills or mountains. And basically, they're just these pieces of fabric that stick to the bottoms of your skis. And the fabric has a diagonal nap to it, backwards facing diagonal nap. And so what that does is it enables you to slide forward, but if there's any backward or downward pressure put on your skis, the fabric just bites into the snow and keeps you from sliding back. I had 2 types of climbing skins: these short ones that would give me enough traction to pull my sled, and I had longer ones that went from the tip of the ski to the tail, and those would enable me to climb really impressive, pretty steep slopes, even with this heavy load behind me. Now, I think at this point I wanted to read a little passage for you about this first part of the journey on skis, climbing up towards Telqua Pass. And this passage starts in the morning. Striking camp is the bane of winter travel. You want nothing more than to move because it's the coldest time of day, but you can't yet. I often wiled away the sheer boredom of the task by speculating that it was this hassle of breaking camp that ultimately made our hunter-gatherer ancestors abandon the wandering life, plant seeds, and trade tents for houses. The worst part of breaking camp for a winter wanderer is every day seeing more and more condensation getting folded into your tent, into the tent that you've worked so hard to keep dry. Once I was back on the trail, the climbing started immediately. This meant whole miles of sapping herringbone steps. Climbing herringbone steps is usually a last resort for skiers, a tiring and awkward technique for going over short stretches of terrain that are too steep to skin up. But with a heavy sled at my back, I sometimes had to advance this way for an hour at a time. This time, it was early in the day, so I relished the effort. The landscapes were stunning. I knew I was the only human on all the land I could see. The mountains were beginning to look like real peaks, masses of rock and ice that soared above tree line. Unimaginably tall yellow cedars, also called Nootka cedars, towered around me, their lime green sprays of needles glowing as brightly as the snow. The trees were laden with snow, but seemed calm and at rest. The sun striking them made a kaleidoscope of glinting colors. During a cruising descent after a 3-mile climb, my mind eclipsed itself so that it was nowhere else. The uphill struggle had so absorbed my mental energy, drawn me so deeply into the weave of the winter world, that I was in a state of pure perception. The intensity had begun as pain, but without lessening had morphed into pleasure. A flock of pine grosbeaks came in over my left shoulder and started making noise. I kept an eye on them as I slid effortlessly downhill, and in a minute it occurred to me that they were dressed the same as I was. Red heads and breasts, black beaks, black and white wings, and spindly black legs. They flitted from tree to tree beside me, as if stepping down the hillside to keep me company. It would have been no great leap to believe I was picking up odd words among their piping, the way one does in a language one has studied only a little. On the higher sides of the valley were massive clear cuts of a size and steepness you could never really quite believe unless you've been to British Columbia. The patches were cut from the sheer flanks of mountains and were not contiguous with lower cuts. It was hard to imagine how it could be worth the cost and effort required to take timber out of such inaccessible places. The climb into Talpa Pass really begins 33 miles up the road from the mouth of the Copper River. Here, the last of the snowmobiles had turned toward home. I would be the first and probably the last traveler until the snow melted in April. This was wilderness. I made my own tracks now. So skiing along for a few days, and thanks to my climbing skins, eventually I was up in terrain that looked like this, real mountains. And so this was kind of the final part of the climb to the pass. So you have to imagine a row of mountains to my south like this, and then there's a mirror image of mountains to the north. And the valley is just getting narrower and narrower as it climbs higher and higher, and then eventually I would reach the pass. And as I got closer, there was just the stream occupying the bottom of the valley, and it was kind of choked with alders and willows and trees like that. And I was sometimes forced up onto these slopes on the sides of the valley, which were quite steep, and there was a lot of snow on them. And that combination spells avalanche danger, which it was not ideal when you're hauling a 100-pound sled that's secured to your waist. And it was just as I was beginning to consider how unwise it was to be doing this that I heard this bang really loud, like a cannon, 600 or 700 yards in front of me, and the whole side of this mountain came sliding down, and powder snow shot hundreds of feet into the air. And of course, I stopped dead in my tracks and thought about what to do. And I dug out my camera, and even 2 or 3 minutes later, when I took this picture, you can see that the snow still hasn't settled to the ground. So it was really disturbing. And one of the reasons it was so disturbing was that it was getting close to dark at this point, and I knew I was going to have to sleep somewhere near the base of this slope. On the left-hand side is there's that flat white expanse, and that was a lake. But again, it was early in the winter; it hadn't been very cold. So I didn't think it would be a very good idea to ski out onto the lake and try to camp somewhere out there. And so I had to sleep pretty close to this slope here. And needless to say, it was not a very good night's sleep. And it was really the first time that I seriously started to wonder and question the wisdom of what I was doing. But I did make it through the pass and down the other side, and it was an exciting moment to get down the other side, and it was made more so by the fact that I had this kind of chance encounter with a young couple. They were about my age, who invited me to spend the night in their home and dry off my things, and we had a lovely dinner together. And really, this was the first of a long series, you might say, of human encounters, really, that are peppered through the book. And they're really important to me personally, because I mentioned that by the time I'd set out on this journey, I was really upset with my wife, and this was kind of my way of putting distance between us. But it was also I was kind of sick of humans in general, and this was sort of a way of getting away from society. And so the last thing I expected was to be having all these warm and generous encounters with other human beings. But really, it happened all the time along the way. Nearly every time I came into some kind of a settled place and met people, I was treated really generously and often invited to stay in people's homes. And so anyway, this was kind of the first instance of that. And so in some ways, it was an important moment. This picture here, not a great picture. I'm sorry to have left it up for so long, boring you. But it was taken in a cabin outside this little village, and some local people had suggested that I sleep there rather than in my tent because it was better shelter. But the pictures here really to show you my sleeping bag, which is, I might say, was my most important piece of equipment because staying warm at night was essential. And so the sleeping bag was kind of a fancy piece of equipment. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because it's not a subject that interests most people. But I know at these talks there are often people who are interested in winter camping, and so I'll mention just two features of it. One is that it had this twin top. It had two separate tops. Usually a sleeping bag just has a single top and a single bottom, and so the two tops had two different thicknesses, and what that meant was that you could use them to make three different configurations. Use the thin top alone, the thick one alone, or both. And using both, supposedly, you could use the sleeping bag down to 80 degrees below zero and still be warm. And after having used it, I believe it. And then the second feature that's interesting is that it has a zip that goes pretty much all the way around the sleeping bag, which is unusual. And what that does is enables you to ventilate it in all kinds of ways, and that's very important for keeping condensation to a minimum in your tent. Now here, finally, a map. So you can see Prince Rupert, the town where I landed, and then started traveling east at the upper left-hand side of the map, the northwest corner. And then you see Terrace, that first town where I actually started skiing. And then between Terrace and Talquay, you see the pass. And so that first mountain crossing section that I described is that tiny little section of the map. But it was 7 or 8 days. And those were physically the most demanding 7 or 8 days of the winter. And I think that if my journey had been limited to that week crossing Talquay Pass, I think that it would still be physically the most difficult thing that I've ever done. But again, it's just a tiny fraction of the winter. And so about 3 weeks into the journey, somewhere in the middle of British Columbia, it became apparent to me that there was no way I was going to make it all the way across Canada as I had thought I would be able to do, comfort of my home in Italy. And so I had to sort of shift the focus. And in that point, what became most important to me was going all the way across the season, across winter, skiing from one end of winter to the other. And what you see on your screen now is the journey as it actually unfolded. So the route pretty much corresponds to the first half or so of the original route that I planned. And the idea was basically to straddle the 55th parallel, which you see marked going across the middle of the picture. And the 55th parallel, to me, represented kind of the middle of the boreal forest, which is that typical evergreen birch forest that you think of when you think of Canada or Scandinavia or Siberia. And that's the place where historically, in the old world, where skiing first evolved. And so I really liked the idea of skiing across this kind of landscape that in some way was meant to be skied across. Excuse me. Got a bit of a dry throat tonight. I think it's from the airplane. One of the questions that I sometimes get when I'm doing these talks is, were you following an official trail? Is there a standard route for going across this part of Canada in the winter? And the answer is no. I had to sort of piece together my own route. And that consisted of all kinds of things. So to get across the mountains, that first section that I described, I was just following an ordinary trail, the kind of trail that you would hike on in the summertime. But in other places, and especially in British Columbia, I used a lot of logging roads. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of miles of logging roads in British Columbia. And most of them are just these, single lane gravel, unimproved gravel tracks cut through the wilderness that go into, the remotest corners of the province. And most of them in any given year are not plowed or not graded, not cleared in any way, because they're not being used to actively take out timber. So just a tiny amount of the total mileage is actually cleared. And those uncleared roads become, they just lie under 2 or 3 feet of snow, and they become perfect ski trails for someone like me. Now, the picture on your screen now is a logging road, but this is a kind of a more important artery that's probably going to a logging camp or something. And so it's wider, and there's a power line, as you can see. And another possibility was the railroad. And I relied on the railroad for a couple of 100 miles mostly in Alberta. But a thing you have to understand about railroads in this part of the world is they are often in places where there are no normal, automobile roads. So they could be hundreds of miles from the nearest road or from the nearest town. And basically it's just that they connect, one town to another by the shortest route, which in northern Canada is often straight across the middle of the wilderness. Now in this picture, I'm coming into a town. This is one of the pictures taken by another person. Were you, Kim? But usually it was more like this kind of thing. So you'd have, many tens of miles like this with no sign of people or towns or buildings. And a train would come by at most once every 24 hours, but sometimes not for 2 or 3 days at a time. And if of course it snowed after a train had passed, then the rails themselves would disappear. And so it was kind of like skiing along the logging road. Other possibilities were snowmobile trails, and then once I got into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, lakes. I skied across many lakes. Those provinces have, tens of thousands of lakes covering their northern regions. And of course, they're all frozen and snow covered, and so they become great ski trails as well. Now, I mentioned that one of the themes of the book is this question of how we as humans move across the landscape. So it's something that I had to think about a lot on a concrete level. But sometimes I would see things that would make me start to think of it, poetically or philosophically. But that's kind of the spirit of this picture, which is just a mouse track. But I thought it had a certain elegance to it, the way the line goes across the snow. And then what I especially like about it is that you can see it's the mouse's trail being dragged along behind it, connecting the dots. Here we are looking at the Peace River. The Peace River was the most important river that I crossed. I crossed it on a railroad, a high railroad trestle, which is kind of a scary moment. But it was exciting because of what the Peace River represented in my mind. It's a north-flowing river, and it flows north and then into the Slave River and the Mackenzie River, and then ultimately spills into the Arctic Ocean. So this idea of being kind of palpably in the watershed of the Arctic Ocean gave me a bit of a thrill. One thing that's interesting is that so this was probably the northernmost point of my journey, and one of the coldest places in the days preceding my arrival in the valley of the Peace River. It had been like close to 50 below, I think, which I fortunately dodged. But in spite of the steely cold, the Peace River at this point, it still flows in liquid form because there's a dam just a couple miles upstream that's constantly modulating the level of the river, and so it stays liquid even when it's really, really cold. And that was kind of strange to see because I was so unused to seeing water in its liquid form by that point. And finally, at this point, we're in Alberta, and Alberta was different from the other areas I skied through in that occasionally I was kind of forced by geography, I guess, down onto the prairie, and I would have to ski 2 or 3 days at a time over these parts of open prairie, and it was January at this point. So what that meant was that it was often very cold and very windy, which is an unpleasant combination, as I'm sure you are aware of. And here, a snowbank along the side of the road, and you can see there's this sort of serrated pattern, which is normal there just from the constant wind tearing across the snow. Here again, Alberta, along a railroad track. This is pretty typical of like the kind of little settled place that I would come into every few days in Alberta, just a little cluster of houses. And the atmosphere here is really, really typical of this time of this part of the year. There were these long morning and afternoon twilights, and often the air had this sort of pink color to it. Grain elevator, not something I expected to be seeing as far north as I was, but occasionally on the prairie I would see one. And then it was also here in north central Alberta that I came to the first of the three really big lakes that I would ski across, and this one was called Lesser Slave Lake. Later in the winter, I'd ski across a lot of smaller lakes too, but there were 3 really big ones. And I think here, kind of the cold. This was probably a little bit earlier than this time of the year, but it was really bitterly cold, clear, often very clear days. And I think at this point, it would be good to read another passage about winter, what it's like to be out there in the winter time in general. Like northern towns, whose very existence I sometimes doubt, winter is hard to imagine in summertime. When birds peep and the air pulses with cicada song and plump leaves flutter on the breeze, it takes no special awareness to see that the earth is alive, or even to recognize benevolence in it. The thought of ice only brings refreshment. It's an accent on the day, like a dash of pepper on your picnic lunch. The ice cubes in the cooler are delicate things to be carefully kept from melting. It takes intense mental effort to turn the world, on which your very sense of being depends, inside out, so that those glistening little cubes that under the sun look almost like jewels become the dominant element, invading everything else, silencing the music of summer, and freezing the trees into leafless submission. Your own being will be profoundly anxious until you find some way of making heat, which your vigilance will then turn to guarding jealously. The friendly summer world has now become impossibly distant. The purpose of winter is to reveal weaknesses in living things. Such weaknesses are identified by restriction of the solar energy that is fed into an ecosystem, which puts everything in it under stress. Diminished sunlight and the resulting cold are the generic stressors, But more specific phenomena test individual members of an ecosystem: starvation, heavy snow loads, blowing ice particles, dehydration, and ice formation that can kill in several ways. Once weaknesses are identified, inefficiencies can be purged and excess pared away in a process of consolidating the gains of the preceding summer, so that the seasons can be seen working together to maintain strength. Living beings that can't make do with the restricted energy input are killed without fanfare. When on clear, cold days you are skiing across a vast expanse of white emptiness, and the air seems perfectly still, and you can almost imagine there is nothing alive on Earth except for you, you sometimes hear wind currents tangling in the upper air. They moan or make soft howling noises, and in so desolate a place they seem to cry out to have meanings attached to them. But these writhing drafts have no meaning. The rest that one poet finds in silently falling snow is, for another, winter muffling its victim's screams with a pillow. Still, there's an irony detectable in winter that enables me to see it as something more than a single-minded eugenicist. Snow keeps things warm, for instance, by reflecting the sun's warmth, which threatens to melt it. As the snowpack ages, water molecules migrate vertically in a process called constructive metamorphism, which provides protection from cold and predation for small creatures beneath it, but at the same time renders the surface sometimes dangerously unstable to large animals above. Winter's ironies multiply every time I go out skiing and look around. We think of winter as a time of restriction, but what of all the coyotes I saw one afternoon last winter as I skied out onto the lake near my home? There were 7 of them. I do not see 7 coyotes in 7 years in other seasons. Here, ice doubles the size of the world for some land animals. Winter expands the range, and the wild canids come out of hiding. But where coyotes and wolves and foxes win confidence from the opening up of the land, the temptation to occupy the void heightens vulnerability for others. Prey animals are the most obviously vulnerable. But ice has its own dangers, and its hidden weak spots can do in even the strongest predator. Death comes in ways you might not at first expect to. 2 winters ago, on an exposed stretch of snowless ice, I saw a frozen doe, as yet unscavenged. It seemed her hooves could get no purchase on the slippery surface, and she was immobilized beyond redeeming. I think I'll stop there, but forgive me for ending on kind of a dark note. There are brighter moments even in that chapter. What you're looking at here is my camp. It looked like this every night with different backgrounds, of course, different settings. I used this tunnel-shaped tent, which tends to be more wind resistant than other designs. It's divided into 2 compartments, and I would sleep in the compartment that's farther away from us here. And in the nearer compartment, which is called a vestibule, I would store anything that needed to be kept out of the weather. And that's also where I did my cooking every evening. Now, the cooking itself was pretty quick and straightforward, but after that I had to keep my stove running and spend a couple of hours or more even just shoveling snow into my cook pot and melting it into water for the next day's consumption. And I would boil it and then pour it into a thermos, and that was my water for the next day. But it was while I was sitting there waiting for the snow to melt that I would also write in my diary every evening in pretty considerable detail, and that became very helpful, of course, when I sat down to write about the experience. We're now in Saskatchewan, the 3rd province. It's February. The days are getting noticeably longer, and this second part of the summer, the winter, I'm sorry, was much sunnier than the first part of the winter had been. And so it was really quite lovely. There was a string of days in Western Saskatchewan where I just kind of, the days sort of all blurred together, and it was cold but very bright, and the snow kind of sparkled, and I just cruised across the landscape day after day, just really enjoying being there. Now my skis, which unfortunately I don't have to show you since I'm not in person.
Anders,
Yes.
and I just wanted to let you know that it's 7 o'clock. It's
Okay.
8 o'clock your time. So we
Yes.
have about half an hour.
Yep. Sounds good. So my skis were, oh, okay. They were made by this little Norwegian company called Osnes. It makes skis for ski touring expeditions, things like that. And anyway, each model is named after a different Norwegian explorer. These were named after Roald Amundsen. And so there was this picture of Amundsen emblazoned on my skis, and he had this sort of stern look on his face that whenever I felt, discouraged or faint-hearted, it was enough to just make eye contact with Mr. Amundsen, and that would give me the kick in the pants that I needed to keep moving. Now here we are looking at the home of a character in the book whose nickname was the Cossack. His real name was Don, but he was of Russian and Ukrainian ancestry, and he was just this sort of, well, kind of this crusty northern character. He was a dog musher, very much a bachelor, and highly entertaining person. So there's a whole chapter in the book that talks about Don Skopic. I spent a couple of days with him, and he actually was sort of instrumental in the biggest change to my route. He suggested that I ski on this chain of lakes starting in a town called Pine House. And I think actually I'm going to just read a quick little passage that involves the Cossack, because he was such an entertaining character. So I spent a night at his house, and then he drove me about 30 miles north to this town called Pine House, which is kind of a shortcut. And then from there, I was able to ski across this chain of lakes. So I think I'm just going to read about the day that he drove me up to this other place. It was late morning when I had the car loaded. Don walked out of the house carrying only a rifle in one hand and something white in the other. He raised it like a flag to reveal a pair of briefs. Always gotta bring extra underwear to Pine House. Last time I was there, it was supposed to be for 3 hours, and I ended up staying for 3 days, he said. He pitched the rifle and the briefs onto the back seat, got into the car, and backed out of the driveway. He nodded distractedly toward the coin dish in the center console. See if I've got any bullets in there, will you? There's a couple, I said. Good, you never know when they might come in handy. Before leaving town, we stopped at the post office, where Don mailed a heavy box of coins to a man in Quebec while I filled his car with gas. He was a coin collector. When we were underway, Don told me that the road to Pine House was straightforward, 30 miles east and 30 north. Then he said, sorry, I'm still on the miles. There's no population between the 2 points, and the road was lonely. At one point, on the northbound stretch, we took a break on the side of the road where there was a weather-worn map of northern Saskatchewan on a billboard that seemed out of place. Far to the north of the line of small settlements shown strung out along the Churchill River, there was an isolated dot at Key Lake. Till the 1990s, Key Lake was home to a high-grade uranium mine and is still the site of the largest uranium processing facility on Earth. It is economically important, even in Pine House, 130 miles to its south. It must have been the thought of uranium that prompted a leap to nuclear waste and the selection by Canada's Nuclear Waste Management Organization of the Precambrian Shield outside Pine House as a possible dump site for spent nuclear fuel. Don told me about rumors of payouts being used to win the support of power brokers in Pine House. Similar claims have been made about Patchnak, another proposed site. It was sad to see this part of the world, which appears hardly touched by industrial modernity, and to know that such ideas have been put on the table. Regardless of one's views on nuclear energy, it seems the height of folly to propose storing high-level radioactive waste underneath one of the most intricate and extensive hydrological systems on Earth. The Canadian Shield, still rebounding from the weight of its last glaciation, to this day can still flip the pitch of a watershed like players in the marble game Labyrinth who tilt the board on its perpendicular axes to steer the marble home. Thanks to intense grassroots resistance, which was in full swing at the time I was there, neither community was being considered any longer. Don drove slowly and surveyed the roadsides, commenting on the animal tracks he saw. At one point, he braked to a crawl. I'm trying to figure out what the track is, he said. Looks like a wolf, but it's perfectly straight. Must be a lynx. There's lots of rabbits in through here. Canada lynx, which are about twice the size of large house cats, subsist almost entirely on snowshoe hares. So much so that populations of the two species can be seen to rise and fall drastically in cycles lasting about 20 years. Hare populations can go from as high as 6,000 per square mile to as low as 31 per square mile in a matter of a couple of seasons. In such years, lynx will produce small litters, forego breeding altogether, or suffer devastating rates of infant mortality. Lynxes hunt by stalking and then pounding after the prey on snowshoe-like paws that keep them afloat in the snow. 6 miles south of Pine House, we saw a set of clumsy human footprints going into the bush off the right side of the road. Don suspected someone had killed something. A few yards farther on was a truck backed away from the road, and a man standing in the bed keeping watch. Don stopped, rolled down the window, and greeted the man in Cree. He asked if he'd shot a moose. At first, the man tried to dodge the question, but he eventually admitted that he had, explaining that his hunting companion had wounded it the day before, and they were just getting it out of the bush now. Don and the man seemed to recognize each other, but evidently didn't know each other well. Nevertheless, Don felt compelled to tell him that he so enjoyed coming to Pine House that he'd brought an extra pair of underwear with him. The man nodded and smiled uncomfortably. Don wished him luck, and we drove on. All right. So thanks to Don, I was put onto this chain of lakes that was part of the Churchill River system, and it would take me to this town, to a town called La Range. And so I skied from lake to lake. And this picture was taken just after I'd come through the most harrowing day of the whole winter. The one time when I really thought that I might not make it. I was out in the middle of a pretty good sized lake, and a whiteout storm really descended quite suddenly and eliminated all visibility. And shortly thereafter, I realized that there was water creeping up through the ice, through the snow, I should say, which was very irritating to say the least. Anyway, this is kind of a crux of the book in some ways. But I did get through, made it through the storm, and this picture was taken near the end of that day as I was approaching a town of La Range, where I had a contact who was holding a food supply drop for me, and he was kind enough to ski out like 6 or 8 miles to his west and meet me out on this lake, and I had never been so happy to see another human being. These next few pictures were taken just a few days later on a lake called Lac La Range, which was the largest lake I skied on over the course of the winter. One of the largest lakes in Saskatchewan. Where I crossed it, it was between 30 and 40 miles wide. And so this picture is here just to kind of give you a sense of scale. The black line on the horizon is an island, not the mainland. Here again, so I had to get across the lake, I had to spend 2 nights out on the sleeping out on the ice. And here you can see one of my campsites that there's no land anywhere in sight. And then finally, we are in Manitoba, last province I skied through. This picture was taken by a local newspaper reporter just south of a little town in northern Manitoba called Flin Flon. Flin Flon is also an important mining center. There's a huge copper mine there, and so that smokestack you see in the background is from the smelter of the copper mine. And this next picture is part of the same series, taken from behind. And I'm heading into what turned out to be the last 10 or 12 days of the journey. And so that's the end of my slideshow, basically. There are a couple of loose ends I want to tie up before going to questions. Are you trying to talk to me, Zoe? Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm thinking we should move on to the questions now.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, let me just tie up these 2 loose ends. So the first is I mentioned that the story of my apparently disintegrating marriage was kind of paralleling the story of the journey itself. So one thing, and I'll just say it quickly, although the story is a lot more complex in the book, of course. The book has a happy ending in that after a very long separation, a 5-year separation, my wife and I eventually were able to see beyond our differences and patch things up, and we eventually got back together. And so there's the visual aid to go with that. And then the other thing I want to mention is I started the story. I started talking this evening about Tony Matt, the Austrian ski racer, and the story of him running over his skis and never skiing again after having terrified himself coming down Mount Washington. So when I realized I wanted to use that story to frame my own story, I thought I'd better check the facts to make sure I had them all correct. And anyway, the short version is that I eventually had to write to this ski historian in New Hampshire and ask him about this. I couldn't find anything about him running over his skis and never skiing again. And what he told me was, no, that didn't happen. That was just my father's invented ending to the story. But it contained this insight, which I thought was valuable, and so I decided to tell the story all the same. And with that, I will leave screen share, and we can talk. Oh, stop.
Great, Anders. Thank you so much for your talk and those great slides. Wow. Now we'll have about a half an hour. We'll move on to the discussion. And if you want to talk, we ask that you unmute yourself and use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, and then mute yourself when you're through. And Kim will call on you. And if you want to write a comment instead, you can use the chat feature, which I'll monitor. So Kim, why don't you start this off?
Well, I just want to make a comment on my own question and comment. I mean, I was really scared for you in that chapter where you just sort of ended. It was just a few slides at the end when you came across the lake and you got in that blizzard and a whiteout and you couldn't see your directions. And I really, I knew you had to have come through it because you wrote the book, but I was so scared. It was a really compelling chapter. And I thank you for sharing that experience with you. And when you were swearing at the elements and Mother Nature and saying, how could you do this to me? I have felt that way when I've been outside in the winter, just working, doing land stewardship at a preserve and thinking, oh my gosh, this is so cold and miserable.
Yeah, no.
So I just wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that it was evocative in that way. It was terrifying. The most terrifying thing I on the other hand have not very often, or probably never felt that way while being out. It was awful. So I tried. That was hard. That was a tricky section to write, I have to say, to try to get back into my mental state at the time, because I've never been that scared.
Was that when you were going across the lake?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a related question in the chat here. Somebody asked, how did you secure your tent to the frozen Lac L'Orange?
Yeah, so when you get snow on lakes, if there's snow, lakes are exposed and windy, and so you get this what's called wind pack. So the snow is pretty hard, pretty crusty, and so even though it wasn't very deep, maybe like 6 inches or so, the snow itself, it's like, well, it's not quite like concrete, obviously, but it's pretty compact, and so that is actually one of the easier places to set up your tent. Because usually you've got lots of soft powder snow that you have to compact. I would have to spend about 45 minutes just compacting a platform for my tent. So on lakes, I didn't have to do any of that. I would just set it up and jab the stakes into the snow, and I was ready to go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I see Michael has a question. He raised his hand.
Your hand.
Among the many commentaries about history, natural history, people that I found interesting, I particularly appreciated the chapter about trails and what you learned from that, and the role that trails play in societies of various kinds. I wonder if you could say a little more about that. that seemed to be a very important part of the journey, and I really liked what you had to say about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad that you appreciate it. That was one of my favorite parts to write. Um, it's something that I've thought a lot about over the years. But there are quite a few ideas in there. But one that connects to what the last question about being scared and um, getting lost out on this lake was precise. There was very much this because I had been following kind of a trail that had been left by some snowmobilers, not recreational snowmobilers, but trappers who'd been going out to their cabins. And so, this snowmobile track presumably would lead me back to um, the town of La Ronge, which was at that point probably 20 miles to my east. But as I saw this storm kind of start brewing, there was this very real sense in which the trail was kind of a lifeline. It was this thing that was connecting human communities, and I was on it, um, benefiting from it. And the prospect of this storm coming and sort of obliterating this trail, this lifeline, was really kind of intensified my fear. And it came to I really at that point I really valued uh, in a way that I never had before. That meaning of trails as kind of this really basic, um, uh, basic instance of what I call infrastructure. Infrastructure in the book's not a great word, but like just these human institutions that we have that we don't think about that connect us, that have this sort of social purpose. So that's one thing I'll say.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat. How did you handle hygiene?
I haven't had that question in any book talks. That's a question when I was planning the journey. That's a question that was the first question that almost every Italian asked me. So that was a big concern for the Italians. Yeah, how did I handle hygiene? Well, I you know, I didn't sweat much. I tried. It's very important when you're spending night after night out in the winter in a tent to keep as much moisture as possible out of all of your clothing and all your equipment, because as soon as it freezes, that ice is not going to go away. And so I had to train myself to ski fast enough to stay warm, but not so fast that I would start sweating. That was something that I'd spent the winter before the journey kind of working on. Like it was a matter of kind of it was more mind than matter. And so that was the big thing, I guess. I mean, the sweat is, I guess, what really would make you dirty in the wintertime. And so I didn't sweat very much. Other than that, probably wasn't the cleanest person in the world. As it happened, I I spent a lot more nights indoors over the course of the winter than I expected to. Um, I mentioned earlier that pretty much every time I would see someone when I would come into a settled place, once every probably 7 or 10 days, I would be invited to spend a night in someone's home, and of course, whenever that happened, I would take advantage of the chance to get a shower. Um, this is one thing I'll say about hygiene, kind of a funny story, is you tend to lose your sense of time when you're alone all the time, and I had one timepiece with me, but it was battery powered, and I didn't like to turn it on because I didn't want to run down my batteries. So I usually didn't know what time it was or how much time was passing. And so I would brush my teeth every evening after I'd eaten. And then sometimes it would suddenly dawn on me that I had been brushing my teeth for, like 45 minutes. Well, probably, I don't know. I would think, oh, so like, I don't know. Anyway, that was just something that would happen, losing the sense of time while brushing my teeth.
Well, that is funny, Anders. I, I um I I'm a romantic, and I really also appreciate, so I'm really happy that you and your wife are back together and that you were able to work out your differences and come to an understanding, and that you're
So am I.
living the way you are, that you have this agreement. Sometimes you're over in Italy, sometimes you're in New Hampshire, but I really appreciate you being so open and sharing about your relationship too. So thank you for sharing about your relationship with your wife, and
Yeah,
how that impacted, and your decisions, how your decisions impacted your marriage. I mean, that's something, we all have choices to make, and that impacts our lives with whoever we choose to spend time with. So I thought that was really interesting to hear your perspective and hear your journey through that relationship too. Are there any other questions or comments? I
oh,
see Linda Peters.
hi, Linda.
You're on mute. Oh,
Oh, I can unmute you. No, or, no.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Beginner mistake. I appreciate the quote from your book where I clipped today. People living in the woods, not offending the woods. I have a lot of experience living in tents, usually in the warmer weather, but I have noticed that when I'm alone in a tent, like you, I turn into a philosopher. And the question I have is, what do you think is the optimum land use so that people can live in a unobtrusive kind of place and yet not be so spread out that they take up too much land and its resources?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you liked that phrase because that's one of my own personal favorites in the book. Um, and I'm certainly not an expert on the subject, but I have a special fondness for small towns. Um, and I live in a town called Littleton, New Hampshire, which is the kind of town that used to get built more often, that has a nice compact center, but then it's surrounded by lots of open land. Um, and so I think that towns are wonderful because they have the benefits of the city. You have a certain density in the center, and so that you have all the services together, and people can um, benefit from that. But then it's easy to get out and enjoy the open space.
In the winter, can
I don't-
you literally go out the back door and ski somewhere nice?
Yeah, I can, even though there are a few other houses, so there's kind of a network in my little neighborhood. There's a network of trails that kind of sneaks out behind the houses, and then a few hundred yards up the road, it's basically wilderness here in New Hampshire. Um, Now, of course, I'm very fortunate in that, but I mean, the town is 5,000 people, but it's the old kind of town where pretty much all of those 5,000 people are crammed into the middle, and then there's like this lots of open space. There's not a lot of like sprawl outside of it. So I think that's great because you have the benefits of the city living, its efficiencies, but then not the claustrophobia that goes along with it. And then you don't have the kind of waste of suburban living where everyone has to have their own septic system, and everyone has to be driving a car, no matter where they want to go and so forth. So I don't know. I like towns, little towns.
Thank you.
I think that
Yes.
Eli, I think, I'm not sure if Eli or Michael was first, so let's go with Eli and then we'll go to Michael.
Okay. Eli, fire away.
Anders, pleasure to get to say hi to you. I just finished your book yesterday, and I gotta say, so many moments in the book that cracked me up completely. I was laughing probably the hardest at your description of snowshoes. And you called them misery slippers. I hope that's not a spoiler for anybody, but I died laughing. Last winter, snowshoes were my gateway into outdoor activity, and I got hooked on that and just got a hold of my first set of cross-country skis, which I had made plans before starting your book, but you sealed the deal for sure. I had a question and I lost it, so I'll just leave it with the comment and thanks for everything that you did.
Feel free to think of your question because I want to say something about it. So the misery slippers, I was, that's an expression that's used by some backcountry skiers. It's not a view that I hold. I actually love. As a matter of fact, this afternoon I was out on my snowshoes. I was not skiing, because I think that there are situations in which snowshoes are much better. I think snowshoes are great for breaking. As a matter of fact, for breaking a ski trail. So I love them, but I do prefer skiing, I have to say. Yeah, so they're both great.
All right, let's go to Michael.
Michael.
A brief comment. One of the things that really helped me in reading your book was following it on my map app on my iPad. I kept switching back and forth. You would name a place, a lake or town, and I would find it on the map and then zoom in and out so I could sort of have some perspective. And so it was really helpful tonight to have the map that you shared with us as well.
Yeah.
That helped me have a sense of what was happening. My question is, you were trained as a historian, right, before this?
Yes.
And I wonder how this experience, both the trip and the writing, reflecting about it, has changed you as a historian. What impact has that had on you in your professional?
Well, I'm not a professional historian. I studied history in college and graduate school, but I don't work as a historian. But what impact this could have had on my view of history? I don't know. That's a really hard question, I have to say. Oh, wow. I don't know. I mean, I suppose one thing, it's more anthropology than history, but like to getting back to the chapter on trails that you mentioned before, just thinking about how these really basic systems that humans have developed exist really in cultures sometimes that we think of as primitive in the past, like not highly developed cultures, are really just earlier forms like trails or earlier forms of road. And sometimes these things have more virtue, or I hate to use that word, but than our modern systems. No, I don't know that. Yeah, I mean, it's just something that I had occasion to think about on a more concretely and over the course of the winter. And so little things like that, as you've read the book, there I talk about infrastructures and tradition, but in how these things are often they make great metaphors for one another. And so I talk about marriage is kind of an instance of this human institution that's been around for a very long time. And sometimes, like in the situation I was in, I would get frustrated. I was frustrated with it, and it seemed like this useless thing. But the more in the years that followed, and the more I thought about it, and the more I lived, and the more I realized that it has a reason for exist. There's a reason that it's been around for so long, and that it's always evolving, but it's useful in one way or another. I think that is it Jen? I think you had your hand raised earlier, but with your real hand.
Yeah. Hi. I enjoyed the book. I was just going to peruse it a little bit, read a couple chapters, and I really enjoyed. I feel like I had to pick it up to see what your next night would be like, because you just never know when you're in the wilderness winter. So we were wondering, my 10-year-old here, about hardtack, and can you direct us to a recipe online?
Thumbs up on that. Yeah.
The recipe that I basically used, now this is going back like 10 years, was on the Mother Earth News website. Did you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, it looks like Jen might have a weak connection. But anyway, so the recipe.
Anders, I'll put it in the chat. Did you say
Okay.
Mother
I'll try.
Earth?
Yeah, it was from the Mother Earth News website, and I'm sure they have several hardtack recipes. But I'll try to find it, or a similar one, and I will send it to you, Kim.
Yeah, and I can forward it to Jen.
Yeah.
And if you could send it tomorrow, yeah, I could email it to everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to find it. I'm not sure it'll be exactly the same one, but more or less.
Or we could make a general suggestion. Yeah. Yeah.
There are some questions in chat, and Zoe, you have your hand up, so you want to
Yeah.
take over?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say one funny thing I thought in the book was when you did that radio interview in the Cree community, Anders, and that it was right after a spot about writing one's own obituary. And so I got a big kick out of that. And I wondered if you could comment a little on how it was, meeting the people in the Cree community who spoke Cree.
Yeah, no, that was so that last passage I read was kind of leading up to our arrival in that town of Pine House, and Don, the guy who was driving along with the Cossack, Don Skopic, had the phrase that he kept repeating about, you always have to bring a change of underwear when you go to Pine House because you never know whether you're going to be there for 3 hours or 3 days.
Uh,
And I thought it was just sort of this funny thing that he was saying, but it was really like that. It was like entering another dimension. The people were so incredibly friendly, and everything just sort of seemed to fall into place. And there was this sense of hospitality that was I've never seen before. They had this community center that was just sort of open, and we walked in, and it was as if they had been waiting for me, and this feast was laid out for me, like soup and cake and coffee. Um, and then the next thing you know, I was being drawn off to go have this interview on the radio, which was then translated into Cree. I was put up for the night in the school library, and there was a couch, and they let me sleep there. The home ec classroom
that
became
was
my,
so cool. Yeah.
and it was like it was crazy. They had no idea who I was. They had no forewarn. They didn't know we were coming. Like Don Skopic, the Cossack, just on a whim brought me to this place. And all of this, kind of within 10 minutes of my arriving, everything just fell into place.
Yeah.
So, I can only assume that that's just how guests are received in that part of the world.
Just briefly, a couple of the questions in the chat. What caused the slush on the ice?
Yeah, so it's not as scary as it might sound to people who don't ski on lakes, because most people, when they think of water on ice, they think that it means you're going to go through the ice. So that wasn't my concern. Slush, it often happens late in the season. It's quite normal, just because I don't really know why the snow kind of heats up, I think, and there's like a layer of water between the snow and the ice. But when it happens earlier in the season, it's caused by the fact that it snowed on the ice before the ice was completely consolidated, and so there's sort of this warm layer between the hard ice and the snow. So if you sink far enough down into the snow, you're going to get into that layer of slush.
Okay.
And the reason it's such a nuisance is that it makes as soon as your skis go through it and then come, especially if you're wearing skins, which are fabric, of course, and then once they come back up and hit the air, all of that turns into ice, and then the snow just clings to the ice, and then the process repeats itself. And so soon you're like walking on these stilts of snow and ice. It's really hard to move.
And somebody asked how you arranged for how the food drop people knew when and where to meet you. I suppose basically emailing them when you stopped at libraries or.
Yeah, emailing, or I had a satellite telephone as well, which could use for that. Fortunately, I never had to use it for anything else. And so I would have them sent to either post offices, general delivery, or in a few cases, you mentioned, local ski clubs had volunteered to hold these parcels for me.
I think Linda has a question.
You're muted, Linda.
Just remembered, talking of trails and developments through time reminded me very much of camping and traveling through the Natchez Trace. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I have, yes.
And the history of the trace says that it started out as the traveling of animals, migrations, and day-to-day travels, and then the Indians, the Native Americans, took the trail over and shared it with the animals, and then the white men, of course, grabbed it and made it their own and made it a road.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed your book in the fact that you talked of the trails being developed over a long time, like the Natchez Trace was, and the fact that it's a huge responsibility to keep grooming it so that other people can get through. And I love how it travels through time like that.
Thank you. One thing that's wonderful about in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, especially where you have all these lakes, is you have these basically kind of in what we can think of as invisible trails. You know, they're just chains of lakes that are linked together by these little portage trails that connect lake to lake. But you know, most of there's a standard route, so it's like a trail, but it's mostly just something that people carry around in their imaginations. So it's an especially nice kind of trail, I think, because it's so light on the land.
Mhm.
Jen asked what company made your sleeping bag.
Oh, I'm glad you asked. My sleeping bag's made by a company that is probably now defunct, although I can't say for certain, which happened to be right here in New Hampshire, of all places, which was kind of nice for me. And it's this guy called Jack Stevenson, who's basically a kind of a family. He and his wife had this little company called Stevenson's Warm Light, and they just made sleeping bags and tents, one model of each, and they're kind of a cult item among high latitude and high altitude explorers both. And he just made them in his home. He was an engineer, and he was also a nudist, a naturist, dedicated naturist, and he believed that you should always sleep naked in your sleeping bag so as to be aware of, you know, how much you're sweating or not sweating. So he's a very eccentric character. But I went to see him in person when I got my sleeping bag, just because I thought, you know, I was doing this sort of this big thing. I thought it might be kind of an interesting. He sounded like an interesting person. But anyway, he's since died, and I think his son took over the business. But then I know that his son has since left New Hampshire, and I don't know if he still makes these sleeping bags. But they're called Stevenson's Warm Light, light written Lite, and Stevenson with a PH.
Could you show the map of your journey again? Obviously.
Yeah, just one moment. Let me go back to that slide. Where is it? Sorry. Go. Screen share. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want me to keep it up, or can I go back to the ordinary screen?
So, sorry, what was your destination? What was your last endpoint? And
The last place the last night I spent on the trail, is that what you're asking?
yeah, what was your last place that you? Where did you end up?
Okay, so I ended up in this little town in Manitoba, central Manitoba, called Swan River.
Oh,
Um, and the last few days were spent skiing. It was really more for fun. So my father joined me for the last few days of the journey. He'd been interested in coming since he'd heard I wanted to do this. And he kind of has a role in the book, a small but important role. He appeared at the beginning of the book and then again at the end. And so we just spent the last few days really kind of skiing in a big circle around this network of long distance cross country, snowmobile trails. And this little system had huts, like warming huts, about well, for us, what we're about a day apart along this trail. And so we slept the last few nights in these huts, and then there was this big bash that was thrown by some snowmobilers I'd met along the way the last night, which was kind of funny. until that's during the book. So anyway, that was in this town called Swan River, which is probably like six or 7 hours north of Winnipeg.
Anders, Mark Luthen is asking if you have plans for more adventures.
Yes, but no more long adventures in the winter time. I've had enough of sleeping in the cold. But yeah, no, I'd love to do lots of. One thing that I would like to do is, and write about at some point is a journey, maybe at least a month, maybe longer, taken entirely at night between sunset and sunrise. And I'd like to write about night, all kinds of, all different aspects of night, the culture of night, the ecology of night, things. And then, but sort of to make myself nocturnal by just going out and walking from sunrise to sunset, and then sleeping by day.
And you have another book planned, don't you?
I do have another book planned. I'm working on it right now. It's kind of it's hard to give a synopsis of, but I think of it as kind of a personal geography of New England. So it's not a travel book in the way that this is. It doesn't talk about a single journey, but there's lots of movement in it. I'm trying to think of my home place. The exercise is to think of my home place in the way that an animal, especially a migratory animal, would think of home. Because I'm connected to a lot of places in this corner of the country, and in the adjacent parts of Canada as well. And so I kind of want to I don't know, take people on a tour, but also kind of describe this fabric of landscapes and culture as part of the world. It sounds kind of wishy-washy, I know.
No, it doesn't sound wishy-washy. It sounds great.
It's just not a very it's not a very tight description, but I have a fairly clear idea in my head of what I'm doing.
Allison is asking if you could tell us a little about your mother's Rockford life.
Oh my goodness. I don't know as much as I should, again, about Rockford. She lived on oh my goodness. Do you remember, Kim or Zoe, what road? I think it's Douglas Street.
Yes, you said
I
Douglas.
think,
Which is
yeah.
near Auburn Street. Is that on the west side of Rockford?
It's on the west side, kind of northwest side. It's a nice area. Yeah.
Yeah, so she grew up there. She was born in Rockford in 1946, January the 1st, at 1 in the morning. But
Oh.
even so, she wasn't the first person of the year. So at the time, apparently there was like an award that you received for being the first person born each year in Rockford. She, even though she was born at 1 a.m., she was not the first person. And I think she's kind of remained upset about that for the past 76 years.
The local paper still likes to brag about whoever the first baby was born.
All right, so it's an ongoing tradition.
Yeah, they still.
So mother was the baby who missed the chance to be the first. But no, I don't know. She lived there until she went to college, maybe even a little bit after that, or into her early 20s.
And what's her name? What was her maiden name and her first name? Just because some people here might know her. I don't know her.
Her name was Ross. Her name is Margaret. Margaret Ross.
Margaret Ross. Does that ring a bell, anybody?
But anyway, yeah, so
I also want to mention Jen has a couple comments in the chat that I just noticed that she appreciated your stories about people and their warmth, and so did I. Their amazing kindness of strangers was really compelling to me. And she said that she had similar experiences traveling by bike across state lines and only through warm seasons. And it brought friendliness right to our feet regularly with questions and offers to stay in their home. So wow, I mean, I can't believe that. It's just really amazing to hear about the kindness of strangers. And Jen said she loved your writing and your thoughtful and insightful observations, and I concur. I agree.
Yes,
I have to,
there are other, yeah, very kind comments. Yeah.
yeah, I also wanted to say that I was really blown away by the story about your dad in the beginning. When you talked about him swooping in and saving you from those boulders. I mean, that was a really exciting
Yes.
and compelling story. I thought, oh my gosh,
Yes.
it was
I'm
really
glad
Yes.
it's
cool the way you
right.
wrote it, the way he swooped
Some
in, and
exciting scenes.
yeah, yeah. So that
Yeah.
was
Yeah, that was
Ah,
amazing. If people want to continue communicating with you, is Facebook a good way?
sure, yeah. I'm on Facebook, Anders Morley. Send
Mhm.
me a friend request or a messenger message. That's a good way.
Okay.
Or I mean, if Zoe, if someone in the audience wants to write me a note, you're welcome to give them my email address. I don't mind.
Okay. Yeah, if
Oh, I won't
I
say it on.
get a request for that, sure. Yeah.
No, I don't want my email to be floating around on YouTube.
No.
What was the main reason that you changed your original route? You took a different route. I think
Yeah.
you say
So
something about it a little bit.
yeah. So there were really the biggest change to my route was uh in British Columbia, where I had planned to ski along a chain of lakes there as well. But it was too early in the winter, and the ice. I was told before I was anywhere near those lakes that there wasn't enough ice on them yet, and that there wouldn't be until much later in the winter. So basically, I had to kind of sweep south of them. That was the biggest change. Then there were other little changes here and there, um, but usually they had to do with ice, its absence. Um, yeah.
But you had
yeah. I
originally
guess
planned to actually go across the whole Canada, but you said that you thought that was not practical.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I first planned the journey, I wanted to go all the way across Canada, but after a few weeks on the trail, it was obvious that at my pace that wasn't going to happen.
Well, I'm going to need to leave the meeting now. Yeah, Kim, you can go on for a few more minutes if you want. But thank you,
well,
everybody.
thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Rockford Public Library, for hosting us. And Bobby, the IT guy, is on with us. So thanks, Bobby, for all your help. I guess we'll just take maybe one more comment or question, and then we'll wrap it up. And Zoe, you can take off if you want to, and then
Okay.
I can.
All right. Bye, Zoe. I'll send you a note.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to get in contact with me, with Anders, you can do it through me, and I'm going to type in my email address right now in the chat, kjohnson@naturalland.org. Just if you want to email me, and then I'll get you in touch with Anders if you have other comments or questions for him.
I'm not going to leave yet because I think that might end the meeting. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Well, so maybe we should wrap things up though, just since
Okay.
Zoe has to close the library.
Yeah.
So any speak now or forever hold your peace, as they say.
Just thank you, Anders. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for coming out this evening.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
Thank you. Enjoyed reading the book.
Yes, a
Thank
wonderful book. I can't wait to read your next book.
All right. I'll try to
Same
be.
here.
Thank you. Wait, when do you think it's going to come out?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
I hope not in the not too distant future, the next year or two. We'll see.
Hey, great.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank
Good
you.
night.
All right.
Thank you for
Thanks for
joining
comments.
us.
See them. Bye.